Have we heard any solidified agreements from the White House, from the U.S. side, and what are we waiting for still to get some details on?
Concepts of a deal, which is a pretty
exactly. Well done.
Yeah, we're starting to hear from the Chinese. They did agree to lower tariffs on a certain range of products. They referenced the agricultural sector. They did confirm the plane deal, although they didn't give specifics that the president referred to yesterday on the way back from Beijing. We are still waiting to hear from the White House a bit more. Again, the details remain scant here. And I think until we have more, we can't really break down just, how much economic cooperation there is here. I think some of this is signaling, of course.
Courtney, it's a quiet weekend for the president. He has executive time, as he calls it, today and tomorrow, but nothing else on the official schedule. How is the White House contextualizing the trip that just wrapped up here? I think a lot's been made of the closeness of the relationship as the U.S. sees it, or as the administration sees it, between President Trump and President Xi. And they've nodded to the fact that there's been this invitation for President Xi to come to the States in September, and there'll be these other opportunities on the heels of that for these two leaders to get together. How much emphasis are they placing on these deliverables amidst some criticism, I think, that maybe the numbers weren't as big as a lot of people, especially on Wall Street, thought they would be? And there wasn't kind of a dialing back of the tariffs that were put in place to the extent that a lot of people expected.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was huge expectation going into this that this was going to largely focus on, stabilizing trade, talking about Iran and any cooperation the U.S. could get with China there in terms of, international support. But I think the White House has so far framed this as a huge success. We heard from the president yesterday. He has praised it as a fantastic visit. He very much was, regaled by all the pomp and pageantry that she had rolled out for him. But a lot of this, as you said, we saw Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and U.S. Trade Rep Jamieson Greer sort of lay the groundwork for some of the deals that we've heard about so far, talking about setting up a board of trade to, open up investment in non-critical sectors. Again, we had expected with the cadre of CEOs, U.S. CEOs, attending this summit that there would be more deals on opening up China's market. We haven't yet to see that. I think there was huge expectation that AI would be a huge talking point with the last minute addition of NVIDIA's Jensen Huang, who jumped on Air Force One in Alaska. But none of that seemed to come to fruition. And, we'll be watching in the days ahead to see if any of those deals, anything along those sort of deals might materialize from the White House.
Courtney, don't go anywhere. We want to bring in Jennifer Welch. She's Bloomberg Economics Chief Geoeconomics Analyst. The other thing that I feel like, Jennifer, we didn't hear as much about and we're expecting to, or a lot of industry folks were hoping to, was some more cooperation on critical minerals. China has really the lockdown not only on the actual minerals themselves, but almost all of the refinement now is done there in the processing, even when they're coming from other places, including Australia. Do we make any progress there? Is there any inclination that this was even discussed to a significant amount? And if not, what does that mean?
You're absolutely right. That was kind of the elephant in the room, that China wields this massive leverage over critical minerals. It was the focus of a showdown between the U.S. and China last year after President Trump hiked tariffs. And even though China has put in place licensing and other regulations to allow the flow of many of those minerals to resume to the United States, there are still restrictions, particularly on those that are headed for defense end uses. And that's obviously a concern that the United States is going to need to bring back stockpiles of munitions that's used up in Iran. And also this lingering question of some regulations that China has put in place over the last few months that seem to be aimed at frustrating any efforts by the U.S. or its allies to de-risk and to develop alternative, diversified supply chains away from China. But as you mentioned, that didn't seem to come up in the meeting, and there's no clarity on whether there's going to be any further relaxation from the Chinese side, or if this is going to continue to be a focal point of tensions.
Jennifer, let me focus on another supply chain I know you've been paying very close attention to for a long while now, and that's the supply chain involving chips, especially those that are made on Taiwan. Of course, Taiwan did come up, brought up first by President Xi, and we've seen President Trump talk more about it on the heels of President Xi's comments, although there was a delay in terms of the U.S. responding to what the Chinese president had to say. But in an interview with Bret Baier on Fox News, the president was asked about that supply chain, the chip supply chain in Taiwan, and here's what he had to say.
I'd like to see everybody making chips over in Taiwan come into America, because to be honest with you, I think it's the greatest thing you can do, because it's a heated situation. There's no question about it. And as you know, we have massive amounts of chip companies now from Taiwan already coming in. We expect to have 40 to 50% of the world chip business by the end of my term. And I think it should be even more than that. I think all of those chip companies, if they're smart, they're going to start heading to Arizona and the places where they're building. That's going to solve your problem.
That's going to solve your problem, the president said. So, Jeffers, kind of situate that in the broader conversation surrounding Taiwan. I think there are probably a lot of lawmakers who are a bit startled by the fact that there wasn't a more forceful message from President Trump about Taiwan, about this weapons deal. And then you had him really expounding quite a bit here on this one commercial side of that relationship. Your reaction to it, and again, kind of, I'd love for you to situate that in the broader conversation about the relationship as it stands.
So I think heading into the summit, there was a lot of concern, including for myself as someone who used to be in charge of writing these talking points for the president, about what the discussion on Taiwan would be, because it requires really careful, delicate language. And President Trump is known from straying from formal talking points. I think what you heard, including in that interview and what he said on the ground, including to reporters, wasn't necessarily the worst case scenario for Taiwan, but it was far from a full-throated defense of both U.S. policy to support Taiwan's defense and the idea of deterring China from ever testing that proposition. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. First, Trump has always been skeptical about supporting Taiwan and other partners. That's something that actually Bloomberg News has reported on for years, including when he was last on the campaign trail. The second factor is I think he's quite cognizant of China's leverage over critical minerals. And he probably heard not just publicly from Xi in remarks before the meeting began, but privately and behind closed doors, how Beijing is quite concerned about U.S. arms sales, especially this reported $14 billion package that is apparently waiting on President Trump's signature. He was pretty non-committal on what he would do with that package once he gets back in Washington. And that alone is a deviation from U.S. policy, which is to support Taiwan's defense, including through arms sales, and not negotiate those sales with Beijing.
Courtney, I also want to ask you about the visit that's coming on the heels of this visit, and that's President Putin has announced this morning that he will be heading to Beijing for a visit as well. There is this theory, and Putin has allegedly been a big proponent of this theory of spheres of influence. His argument is that Russia should get free rein in Ukraine and Eastern Europe. China should get free rein in Asia. And the President Trump and the Americans can handle our own hemisphere. This has been an argument that, depending on the day or who's been in front of them, the president seems to be amenable to, if not all in so far. What does it say to you that Putin is going to meet with Xi, two people who would very much like the U.S. to take a step back in both of those theaters right on the heels of this summit? And I wonder who you think they'll be talking about while they're in the room together.
Well, the obvious answer is Donald Trump, of course, right? So, you know, this is something President Putin said. He was watching Trump's visit very closely. It should come as no surprise that he would want to follow up with a visit to Xi to make sure they're completely aligned. To your point about the spheres of influence, that is something that the U.S. Largely agreed with in the national security statement they released last year, in which they wanted to reassert U.S. dominance in the Western Hemisphere. They've, of course, seemingly gotten a little distracted in Iran. But you know, this is something that I'd expect. It didn't come as a surprise to me to hear that Vladimir Putin would be traveling to China on the heels of Donald Trump's visit.
Courtney, you've taken us right to where I wanted us to go. And Jennifer, I want to ask you just about the broader strategy the U.S. has toward China, and maybe to tee up that part of this conversation. Let me play a bit of sound that our colleague Michelle Hussein had a conversation with Kishore Mahbubani, the former president of Singapore. Let's hear what he had to say about the role that the U.S. is playing vis-a-vis China, and how much success the U.S. could have kind of keeping China at bay.
It's not wise policy of the United States to stop the rise of China, because China can no longer be stopped. And the only way to stop China is to ask the Chinese government to stop improving the livelihood of its own people, right? If you want China, that's the only way that China will stop growing. But China still has a long way to go. Its per capita income is way behind that of the United States. There's a long way to go.
I misspoke there, Mababani, the former Singaporean diplomat. But Jennifer, let me go to you on that point. As Christina talks about these spheres of influence, how even are those spheres? How much influence do you see the U.S. having here? And how much time and attention and eagerness does the U.S. under President Trump have to stop China to the degree that it can?
Well, I think that's a major risk in Trump's second term, especially with the ongoing war in the Middle East, which is quite literally pulling time, resources, and energy out of the Indo-Pacific and directing them towards the Middle East, including missile defense systems that, for example, our Asian allies very much depend on. And what that's symbolic of is something that's been a trend in U.S. foreign policy for over a decade now, which is a desire to want to focus on the Indo-Pacific, the world's most dynamic economic region, home to places, as you mentioned, David, Taiwan, critical supply chains, and yet constantly getting pulled in other directions and distractions. And I think that continues to be a theme here, even though President Trump just made this trip to China. What's interesting is he didn't stop anywhere else along the way. And that's sort of a departure from precedent. Normally, U.S. presidents make a China trip part of a larger trip to the region and use it as an opportunity to signal U.S. presence everywhere there. And in this case, that was sort of a missed opportunity.
Christina, you were there when Trump walked across the border into North Korea.
I was, and that was a multi-part trip as well. And I covered Pompeo the first term. And every time we went to Asia, we stopped in Vietnam. Every single time, we always hit different places the U.S. was trying to get agreements with. Courtney, very quickly before we let you go, we've pivoted to Asia. We've pivoted back. He's back in D.C., the president doing executive time. What is next up on the agenda as far as foreign policy meetings go with the president?
Well, I think we'll be watching to see if the president follows through with a call to Taiwan's President Lai. He made reference to this. He said he needed to speak to the person who is running Taiwan, which appeared to be a reference to President Lai. So we'll be watching to see if that phone call happens. That, of course, would draw China's ire. But I expect we'll also hear the president speaking to a lot of Republicans who are trying to shape what happens next and push Trump towards signing off on this arms deal.